This presentation provides a unique examination of the hunger for land that consumed George Washington as much as his desire for fair treatment of the colonials by British authorities. My name is Edward J. Dodson. George Washington was born on the 22nd of February 1732 in Westmoreland County, Virginia. When he was about 3 years old, the family moved to Little Hunting Creek on the Potomac River, then to this farm opposite Fredericksburg on the Rappahannock River in King George County. After his father's death in 1743, George began to spend an increasing amount of time in the company of his half-brother Lawrence at Mount Vernon. It was from Lawrence that George learned trigonometry and surveying. It was in 1748 that Lord Fairfax sent George with a party surveying lands owned by Lord Fairfax in the wilderness of Shenandoah Valley. The next year, George was appointed as Culpeper County Surveyor. Lawrence died in 1752 from a lung disease, and the Mount Vernon estate passed by stages into George's hands until he inherited it outright in 1761. His inheritance also included a not very productive farm. This is a photograph of the farmhouse as it stood during the mid-19th century. Thus, from his early adulthood, a main financial interest of Washington was the acquisition of land, nearby for cultivation, increasingly distant for speculative gain. At the time of his death, he claimed ownership of tens of thousands of acres spread from the Virginia Tidewater region deep into the frontier of what was then the Northwest Territory. His hunger to acquire land began when Washington was not yet 21. He was appointed a major in the Virginia militia, which not only gave him status within the Virginia colony, but also provided a significant increase in his annual income. A critical step in the rise of his social standing was to become a member of the new Masonic Lodge organized in Fredericksburg. He then took his surveying skills into the wilderness, completing over 200 land surveys. Already he was beginning to acquire a considerable personal estate. He now owned 10 inherited slaves, his brother's 224-acre farm, 3 town lots in Fredericksburg, nearly 2,300 acres of the so-called Deep Run tract inherited from his father, and another 2,000 acres of riverfront land in the Shenandoah Valley. In 1763, he joined with Arthur Lee and others to form the Mississippi Land Company, petitioning King George for a grant of 2.5 million acres of land in the Kanawha River Valley, where they planned to establish a new British colony to be called Kanawha. To give legitimacy to the purchase, they paid the Iroquois 10,000 pounds in goods for title to land over which the Iroquois had no control or claim to. Washington next added his name to the group of the Ohio Company principals maneuvering to open the frontier to settlement by indentured servants brought from England, charged with constructing a road linking the edge of the developed East with the Ohio Company's 200,000 acres of wilderness. The Ohio Company was organized in 1748 by Thomas Lee, president of the Virginia Council of State. After 7 years of hard work, the new arrivals would be given the opportunity to become tenants on the land, providing a rising income to the principals of the Ohio Company until the demand for land increased, allowing profitable sales to begin. Washington and the other principals understood the hunger for land that existed among the colonial population. As historian Willard Stern Randall observed in his biography of Washington, it was a great feudal leap backward in English America, except for the owners of the land, who could look forward to raising the rents and, each year, charging higher base rents to new leaseholders. Sent by the royal governor to affirm Virginia's claim to the Western Territory against French encroachment, Washington carefully recorded the richness of the land across which he traveled. He observed, "We passed over much good land since we left Venango, and through several extensive and very rich meadows, one of which was near 4 miles in length and considerably wide." In 1754, Washington was given command of a force of 300 militia, charged with removing the French from Fort Duquesne at the confluence of the Ohio, Allegheny, and Monongahela rivers. His inexperience resulted in the defeat of his force at Fort Necessity. After losing his commission, he leased, on very favorable terms from his sister-in-law, his brother's 2,300-acre estate at Mount Vernon, and focused on the business of being a planter. Washington later accompanied the British force under Edward Braddock that was defeated near Fort Duquesne. Returned to Virginia, he was given command of the militia and charged with defending the vast frontier. The increasing movement of settlers into regions beyond the coastal plains brought on the violent conflict over territory with the tribal peoples who lived or hunted there. As Willard Stern Randall explains, sharp land dealings in recent years had forced most of the native Shawnees and Delawares off their land and driven them west to the Ohio Valley, where they now fought beside the French. Washington was coming to believe that the underlying problem of defending against the French and Indians was the method of settlement. Newly arrived immigrants in search of cheap land scattered as far as they could from existing settlements. They assured their isolation by staking out as much land as they possibly could. This fact alone made them easy prey for Indian raiding parties. When Washington married Martha Dandridge in 1758, his land holdings increased by nearly 17,500 acres and a considerable amount of cash. Resigning his military commission, he now concentrated on Mount Vernon and his lands. Willard Stern Randall describes his state of mind. If he was at all restless, the form it took was in a determined quest to gain vast tracts of western land that he considered his both by right of discovery as a surveyor and right of conquest as the Virginian who had held on to the frontier backcountry through years of bloody battles and raids. Here his appetite was unquenchable. Speculation in land was now a significant component of Washington's investment activities. In 1767, he wrote to a former comrade in arms, "See what fortunes were made by the first takers up of those lands, nay, how the greatest estates we have in this colony were made. Was it not by taking up and purchasing at very low rates the rich backlands which were thought nothing of in those days, but are now the most valuable lands we possess? Undoubtedly it was. Washington and other partners revived the Ohio Company in 1760. In 1763, he and others formed a partnership to recover swamplands in southern Virginia, acquiring some 1,100 acres and harvesting cypress trees to produce shingles. That same year, he joined with other Virginia planters to form the Mississippi Land Company, purchasing 2.5 million acres of land at the confluence of the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. To bring settlers and civilization to this territory, the tribal peoples had to be subdued or removed. As he wrote in a petition to the English crown, "They have invaded most of the colonies east of the Alleghanies, murdering multitudes of His Majesty's subjects and destroying the country before them with fire and sword. This insult now puts it in the power of the Crown, consistent with justice, to pursue the political plans of getting that country settled as quickly as possible." British landowners did all they could to oppose the land acquisition schemes of Washington and other prominent colonials in America, fearful of losing their own labor force to outmigration. In 1769, Washington's agent, William Crawford, located 2,000 flat, well-timbered riverfront acres in a single tract about 25 miles from what was now the British Fort Pitt. On the 8th of December 1769, Washington at Mount Vernon sent a petition to the royal governor, stating the land around Fort Pitt was selling very fast, and nothing but barren hills and rugged mountains would be left for those who have toiled and bled for the country. The governor agreed and proclaimed that Washington and his officers could choose 200,000 acres, either in a single tract or in 20 separate parcels. Washington sought out the others to attempt to acquire their claims. Eventually, he would add 5,147 acres to his initial grant of 15,000 acres, approved during the Revolutionary War by the Virginia House of Delegates. Washington wrote to Governor Boudetort, "Any considerable delay in the prosecution of our plan would amount to an absolute defeat of the grant, inasmuch as immigrants are daily sealing the choice spots of land and waiting for an opportunity of soliciting a legal title under the advantages of possession and improvement, two powerful pleas in an infant country." Washington left for the Ohio Valley to survey the land and cement his claim. In 1770, he set out down the Ohio with a strong party of men, inspecting lands at the mouths of all the major streams. Then in 1772, he had to make his case for land grants to veterans of the French and Indian War all over again with a new governor, Lord Dunmore. He wrote to the governor, "It is a fact well known, and every age evinces it, that no country ever was or ever will be settled without some indulgences. What inducements do men have to explore uninhabited wilds but the prospect of getting good lands? Would any man waste his time, expose his fortune, nay, his life, in such a search, if he was to share the good and the bad with those who come after him? Surely not. Squatters were already moving onto the land claimed by Washington and refused to leave. His Mount Vernon estate now consisted of 8,000 acres, of which 3,500 acres was cultivated and improved with 30 buildings, including workshops and mills. He was breeding horses and owned some 1,000 head of livestock. He also owned a small fleet of fishing vessels that harvested fish from the Potomac. A larger ship took his commodities to the Caribbean and as far as the Canary Islands. By 1762, Washington had stopped adding Africans to his enslaved workforce because he could not keep the slaves he owned productively engaged. By 1774, his greatest income came from the rents tenants paid him for his farmlands. In 1997 terms, about $320,000 in his peak year of 1774. In July of 1775, Washington received from Lord Dunmore a patent for another 3,000 acres of land at the mouth of the Beaver River. As the conflict with Britain threatened to erupt into full-scale rebellion, Washington had reason to be concerned about his investments in land in the West. As Willard Stern Randall wrote, the House of Commons had passed a new frame of government for Quebec province that extended its borders south all the way to the Ohio River. All the years of expense and defense of the frontier could well be swept away as the vast Great Lakes and Ohio Valley region became part of a new and enlarged British government-controlled Quebec that had few remnants of the rights of free-born Englishmen like Washington. Wiping out all the land grants not only of Washington, but of the Franklins and other land-hungry speculators from Massachusetts and South Carolina. Shortly after fighting broke out in Massachusetts, Washington received a letter from Lord Dunmore nullifying the 1754 Ohio land grant. Washington's attentions were now drawn to the conflict, and he turned his personal affairs over to his brother-in-law. To remove the Iroquois as an effective ally of the British, Washington embraced an aggressive, offensive strategy. The only certain way of preventing Indian ravages is to carry the war vigorously into their own country. In the summer of 1779, Washington ordered a large force commanded by Major General John Sullivan to invade the territory of the Iroquois tribes in western New York, destroying their villages and crops, forcing the Iroquois to withdraw north under British protection. Washington wrote, "The immediate objects are the total destruction and devastation of their settlements." The army destroyed some 40 villages and an estimated 160,000 bushels of corn, as well as immeasurable quantities of other vegetables and fruits. The war finally over and independence secured, Washington turned his attentions again to his personal affairs. He had taken no salary as commanding general, which significantly drained his personal wealth. His land under cultivation around Mount Vernon declined in productivity absent his attentive management. His wheat crop could not be exported because of the British naval blockade. His tenant farmers had no means with which to pay rent, and those who owed him money paid him in depreciated currency. During the war, nearly one-half of his net worth disappeared. Washington presented a written paper to Congress outlining a plan to get the tribal societies to relinquish their claims to the Ohio region. He proposed the granting of land to military veterans, who would not only settle the land, but provide the manpower for an effective militia. War between settlers and the tribal people might have been unnecessary. Armed with European rifles, warrior hunters were quickly killing off the population of game animals, trading furs for weapons and other goods. When the game was gone, the tribes would, as Washington wrote, be as eager to sell as we are to buy. The historian Alan Eckert explains what occurred in the Northwest Territory, what would quickly occur everywhere during the coming decades. Apart from the fact that it was immoral, unethical, and actually criminal, this plan placed before the Congress by George Washington was so logical and well laid out that it was immediately accepted practically without opposition and at once put into action. Without even realizing it had occurred, the fate of all Indians in the country was sealed. They had lost virtually everything. On the 23rd of December, 1784, George Washington addressed the Congress assembled at Annapolis, Maryland. Having now finished the work assigned me, I retire from the greater theater of action, and bidding an affectionate farewell to this august body under whose orders I have so long acted, I here offer my commission and take my leave of all the employments of public office. Soon he was hard at work rebuilding his home and his grounds. To complete his detailed designs, he hired skilled German workers who had come to the United States after the war. Almost daily, he rode a 24-mile circuit inspecting his farms, forges, furnaces, and other construction projects. Washington then resurrected his plan to develop an inland waterway to link the Potomac with the Ohio River, opening the Old Northwest to rapid settlement and commerce with the Virginia Tidewater region. However, he was unable to find others to join him in the risky and costly adventure. He now embarked on a trip into the sparsely populated frontier to inspect the lands he held and to put pressure on squatters to pay back rents. This resulted in angry confrontations. Washington filed a lawsuit against the squatters that lasted for 2 years. Prior to the war, he had constructed a grist mill on the Youghiogheny River, and now he planned to collect the income the mill had earned during the war years and auction off the mill. Later, he discovered the mill was in serious disrepair and a buyer could not be found. At Berkeley Springs, now in West Virginia, he commissioned one James Rumsey to build for him a large shingled house, kitchen, and stable as a summer home near the mineral baths. This would be a 5-room house plus a carriage house partially sunken into the hillside. He contracted with a local landowner near Fort Cumberland to act as his agent to lease out land he owned in the region, subject to a proviso that the virgin oaks and walnut trees were not to be cut down. Learning of recent raids by warriors in the area, Washington decided not to continue further, leaving for a later time the examination of the remainder of his more than 33,000 acres of western lands. Plans for incorporating the Potomac Company proceeded, the venture to be capitalized by raising $1 million in currency, roughly $45 million today. The state legislatures in Virginia and Maryland passed enabling bills. Washington was offered shares in the company to be paid for by Virginia, and Washington accepted, providing for any profits to be devoted to the education of orphans of Revolutionary War veterans. Crews were soon put to work to clear stretches of the Potomac River for navigation. Financial problems arose for the project as subscribers failed to deliver their payments for the shares of stock. Nonetheless, the work continued, and by 1789, the river was made navigable to within 12 miles of Fort Cumberland. A new path to the Ohio Valley was now open. Shareholders of the Potomac Company, Washington included, were poised to benefit from the location of the new national capital not far from Mount Vernon. At the end of his first term as president, Washington confronted the problem of the frontier. As historian Willard Stern Randall observes, the chronic clashing between white settlers and Indians had made him think deeply on the subject, and he urged Congress to adopt just and humane policies for dealing with the natives. He had gone far in changing his thinking since his years on the Virginia frontier, when he only considered Indians as barriers to progress. Randall adds, when he sat down to draw up his will, dated July 9, 1799, he was probably worth $2 million in today's dollars, but most of his assets were tied up in land and slaves, property his heirs could not easily liquidate. His attempts to sell 23,000 acres and 12 tracts of land on the Ohio and Kanawha rivers and in Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania to a speculator led to an agreement, but no cash. After contracting an infection while riding in wet weather, George Washington died on the 13th of December, 1799, after a very brief illness. He clearly left his mark on the pattern of settlement of the frontier during his lifetime. Markers abound to provide some idea of the extent of his land holdings. Including New York State and Kentucky. Martha continued on at Mount Vernon, along with her two grandchildren, Wash Custis and Nellie Custis Lewis, as well as Nellie's husband and their two children. Although George Washington's will stipulated that the 123 slaves he owned outright were to gain their freedom after Martha's death, she decided to do so a year after George's death. Martha lived only a year and a half more. She died on the 22nd of May, 1802. Washington's nephew, Bushrod Washington, who served as a justice on the U.S. Supreme Court, inherited the property after Martha's death. He and his wife moved into Mount Vernon, bringing his own enslaved persons with them. Unable to keep up the costs of maintaining Mount Vernon and the lands, he sold many of the enslaved people to raise cash. He had no children, so after his death in 1829, ownership of Mount Vernon was passed on to more distant relatives. In 1858, a philanthropic organization, the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, was formed to acquire the mansion and part of the family's surrounding land. I think Washington would have appreciated the irony of his image carved for posterity into the land itself.